All right, well, let's get started. Let me click forward. Okay, yes, all right, we're ready to go. All right, well, we're still making our way through the entire Bible. We're in Old Testament survey right now, and we are in the historical book. So we've looked at all of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, and we've now looked at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth, and we're still going through the historical books. What I'd like to do, just as I start, so this is my first section that I've started, I'd just like to remind us that there are different ways to study the Scriptures. There's what's called systematic theology, where you'll take a topic and you'll try to find everything the Bible has to say about that topic. There's exposition, which is where you're taking a book and you're going to go through verse by verse and try to understand the flow of thought. And then there's biblical theology, which is the most akin to what we're doing here, which is to work through the Bible and try to understand the story throughout it, and in particular, how they're connected. And so I thought it might be helpful, just really briefly, 5 minutes, to talk through, maybe we don't think of the Bible as connected. We think of, we're doing Ephesians right now, or we'll, maybe you'll study a psalm or something like that. And we don't recognize that it's really one book in two different ways. It's one book in the sense that the authors of the later books were aware of the earlier ones, and they referenced them, and they continue the story. It's better to look at the new books as new chapters, not new books. It's really like the Bible's one book with 66 chapters, more than it's 66 books, each with different chapters. But even beyond authors, individual human authors, God has weaved the Bible and history together to tell one story. And so I just thought it would be helpful. This is not comprehensive. I didn't research this. I just thought real quickly, what are some examples where you can see an author clearly building upon or thinking back to something else that was written. So again, this is not comprehensive, but I just wanted to throw a couple of these up there. So here's Peter in the changing times of the New Testament. You think it was less than a century that the entire New Testament was written. In fact, half a century or less it was all written. And yet they knew about each other's writings, and they referenced them, and they built upon them. So here's Peter saying that our beloved brother Paul wrote to you, speaking of them these things in which some things are hard to understand. And then he says, as they do the rest of the Scriptures. So again, they had the Scriptures in mind as they penned even their own letters. And here Peter is saying that Paul's writings are Scriptures. When he says, as they do the rest of the Scriptures, like they do Paul's writings, Peter recognized Paul's writing was Scripture, even in the time that he was writing to the folks in 2 Peter. Here's Daniel. I think about Daniel when he was exiled, and he had been there quite some time, and he had gone through a lot of the things we read about in the book of Daniel, and years had passed, and there he was thinking about the book of Jeremiah, and recognizing that Jeremiah had prophesied how long he would be in exile, how long the people would be in exile. And there he is reading about what Yahweh said to Jeremiah. Luke recognizes at the very beginning of his book that other people have written. He knows that there have been others that have written about Christ. 1 Timothy, Paul, when he's talking about how pastors should be allowed to make their living preaching the gospel, quotes two scriptures, one from the Old Testament and one from the Gospels. So Paul was aware of the sayings of Jesus that are contained in the Gospels. Ezra and Chronicles are connected. The same text that you'll find at the end of Chronicles starts Ezra, the same 3 verses. It's the same thing with Amos and Joel. The same verse about the Lord roaring from Zion is at the end of Joel, is at the beginning of Amos. So there's just lots of these examples. I have 2 more. And the reason I'm going to do this will become more evident when we get into 1 Samuel. There's the last 2 slides before we do get into 1 Samuel. But the point of this is to say that really the focus of this class is to see how 1 Samuel and then 2 Samuel and Kings carries on the story. And the point of these slides is to show you they were cognizant of that. And not only the individual authors themselves, but God himself was weaving together a story where they're connected. So here's Exodus and Hosea. So you think about when Hosea comes on the scene and he writes his, it's very clearly, he's referring back to the 10 Commandments. He's very clearly referencing When he's telling the people what they're doing wrong, he's very clearly looking back and referencing what's come before, the Torah. And the Torah is really the foundation of everything. It was nothing before it. It's the foundation of everything. And here is Psalm 89, which I don't think we've read yet. I can't recall in our kind of Bible reading in the mornings. But if you lay that next to 2 Samuel 7, which we studied as part of the Covenants class, you can see, and I won't read it all, but you can see that this author of Psalms was well aware of that covenant, was well aware of this scripture, because it's very clear that he's referring back to the exact wording in that chapter. Okay, so that gets us to Samuel and gets us in the mind of asking ourselves, how does Samuel continue the story from the Torah and from Joshua and Judges? Now, in our historical books, we see, as Frank has already made mention, Ruth is in a different location in the English canon than it is in the Hebrew canon. In the English canon, it comes in our historical books. It's in the writings in the Hebrew canon. Now, that just for clarity, English and Hebrew canon have the exact same books, no difference. Not like the Roman Catholic canon is different. They have additional books. The English and Hebrew canon have the exact same books. They're just counted different and ordered different. So they'll have 22 or 24 books. The Hebrews would say, the Jewish people would say to you, we either have 22 or 24, depending on how they reckon them. We have the exact same, we just count them different. So I'll show that at another class in another week. But right now I just want to point out that in English, Ruth follows right after, in between Judges and Samuel, but importantly, and it's going to be important for what I discussed today, importantly in the Hebrew writings, or in the way that they orient their canon, there is no intervening book between Judges and Samuel. Again, there's good things about both. We talked about the good things about Ruth being where it is in the historical books in the English canon. It was written about a story in Judges, so that's great. It ends talking about Obed being the grandson, Boaz being the great-grandfather, Obed being the grandfather of David, and Samuel's all about David's rise to prominence. There's really good things about whoever did the ordering of the English books. There's good things about Ruth being in the writings. You think it follows generally. The writings aren't always consistently ordered, but it's kind of like the 12 disciples of Jesus when they're listed. They're not always consistently ordered, but Peter's always first, and Judas is always at the in the last four. And it's similarly, Ruth generally follows Proverbs, and you think what would make that what would make that fitting? How does Proverbs end? The excellent woman, and Ruth is a great example of that. So what I want to do is I want us we're going to look in just a moment here as we're going to, just like Frank does, I'm going to walk through at a very high level the book as a whole, but it's going to be really important to remember this connection back with Judges. So let me, okay, I had some slides here I didn't realize. Okay, so let me start with this, that if we take the Hebrew ordering for just a second, and we say, okay, is it just to try to get out of the mindset this is a separate book, as opposed to this is just another chapter keeping the story going? You think about Judges 17 to 21, what I call the dreadful appendix, and you had the 7 judges, the cycle spiraling downward, and then you just had 5 of the worst chapters that exist in terms of how bad things were appearing in Israel and what they did. They had a Sodom and a Gomorrah type incident. I mean, that's what I think that incident in Gibeah was supposed to recollect, is Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it was awful. And then the response of the Levite that we talked about, the Danites and what they did, and taking Micah and the shrine, and that Levite that's going and worshiping and setting up, stealing his mother's golden idol, and then setting up. It's just horrible. This is absolutely horrible. But you can begin to see the connections between that and the beginning of Samuel, and that everything is set in Shiloh. So many of the incidents in Judges 17 to 21 relate to Shiloh. And then the first thing you hear in 1 Samuel 1 is about someone that would go up to Shiloh. So again, thank you, Isaiah, you have that connection. That's a very minor one. I'm going to show you some other connections that really reveal that the author is carrying on the story. And really there's these, this is the best way I could visualize it. There's these really strong links between each of the books. They're not separate.
Can I ask you a question?
Please do.
Do you think it's likely that it's the same author for Joshua, Judges, Samuel?
So, I don't know who the author is at all, but people postulate that Jeremiah might have written them. And, to me, an easier example of this is like the 12, the minor prophets. Like when we get to the minor prophets, I'm going to argue that that's one book. It's not 12 books, it's one book. And the question there is there one person that's because there's structure between the books, those 12 books. It's one story between all 12. Well, how did that happen? So there's one of two answers. Either you had somebody that authored that, all of those. I tend to think that they were individually authored books, each of those 12, but that God superintended their writing such that they tell one story. I don't know the answer between those two. Similarly, we'll see there's serious and significant connections between Judges and Samuel. We're going to see those here in just a second, how they tell the story. Did one person author those, and they were just split because of the length of the books? Maybe. Or did multiple people author them, but they just tell one consistent story? Like, the reason I tend towards the latter is because you think about Genesis and Revelation and how you see I know when you teach Revelation, you talk about the connections between the last two chapters of Revelation and the first two chapters of Genesis. Well, that wasn't the same author there, to be sure, and yet you see these connections. And so it makes me value the Word of God in the sense that I think it was individual authors writing them, but I think you can see God's hand in it and the way they fit together.
But there would be some difference in that example in that we know John would have access to Genesis.
Correct, yes.
And in this case, because I assume these were written fairly close in time to each other.
Maybe, but maybe not, because you think about, like in the case of Moses writing Genesis, for sure, right? Because it was either oral tradition or God directly revealed to him what happened in creation, for instance. So you did have a gap there. But likely they were writing history. I mean, Moses, we believe, penned during his lifetime the events, and likely Joshua did as well. So it's very possible that these writings were done in the time of the actual events, and then later brought into the canon in the form that we have them now. And so in that case, it's very possible that they were not written like at the end. Now Jeremiah's looking back and he's getting oral tradition and everything else and putting them all in one book. It's possible that he's actually taking what existed, the written scriptures that existed during the time of Joshua, during the time of Judges, and they're putting them together in one canon. But nobody really knows. There's some really good books out there on that I can recommend, but I don't know that anybody knows conclusively the answer to that. So either way, it's pretty amazing the connections between the two, and we'll begin to see some of those. And I think they're important, not just so you can see the amazing connections and praise God and recognize His Word as inspired, yes, but also because you can't really understand the book until you see those connections. Okay, so we're going to walk through Samuel. Again, I want to begin real quick summary of what Frank has taken us through. I call it Deuteronomy specifically because it is somewhat of a summary of all that God has done. They're on the plains of Moab and they're ready to go in, and essentially God makes all these great promises to this second generation of what He requires of them and what the warnings are if they don't obey and what the blessings will be if they do obey. Then we get through Joshua. We talked about how God is very clear in Joshua that God has done everything He said He was going to do. We read those verses about how God was faithful to fulfill everything that He had promised, and yet there's still work to be done, and Israel proved faithless, and Joshua charged them to remain faithful. Judges shows that they didn't. We talked about the 7 downward spirals, getting worse and worse each time. The dreadful appendix, which is at the bottom. Could Israel get any lower than that? That's what we're going to actually answer that question today. And my answer is going to be no. They actually get lower, and Samuel is going to be my answer, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And then at the end, in that appendix, we talked about how in those days there was no king in Israel, and how that kind of leads into Samuel, where the major theme is going to be about kingship in Israel. The book itself is about kingship, and so you see that connection with Judges. Now it's interesting to think about timing. Frank mentioned this before. Judges covers 400 plus years. Deuteronomy covered very short period of time, a generation. Joshua about a generation. It's going to slow down again, and we're going to get to cover about 140 years in Samuel only. So it's going to slow down, and we're going to really focus. And you see that in times when God does intervene and make covenants with people. Things begin to slow down, lots of details. You think about the Gospels. They covered mostly 3 years, but lots of information on those 3 years because they were really key in what Christ was doing and what God was doing during those 3 years. So Samuel's one of those. We're going to really slow down because David is going to be a really important figure. So I want to start walking through the book. I'm going to start by asking you, who's the first character, who's the major first character we come upon when we read Samuel? Samuel, that's right. Obviously, Hannah's going to come on the scene. She's very important. But Samuel is the key character that comes on. Now, I want you to think, if you're reading through the scriptures that are in our canon that have given to us, okay, and I want you to just for a moment pretend that Judges 17 through 21 didn't exist. Just for a second. Just pretend. It does exist, and we'll come back to it. But pretend it didn't exist. What was the story just before Judges 17 to 21? We talked about 7 judges. It would have been the 7th judge. Who was the last judge?
Deborah.
Who?
Deborah.
Not Deborah, no. Samson. So in Judges 13 to 16, you have the story of Samson. Tell me a little bit about his story. How did he come on the scene, Isaiah?
He wanted a wife.
Go before that. How did he even come on the scene?
He got born, and an angel came to his mother and said not to drink any wine because he was going to be an Israel Nazarite. And then he went and grew up and got strong with his and was a Nazarite and didn't shave.
Okay, that's good. That's really good. Okay, so now we have this appendix, as it were. Okay, but just now put it aside for just a second. So now you're going to get right into Samuel, and tell me about how Samuel comes on the scene. Somebody other than Isaiah.
Hannah was childless.
Hannah's childless. Now, was that true of Samson's parents?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right as well. What else? What happened as well?
Well, she went to the temple, and not the temple, but she went, where was it, to Shiloh?
Yes.
And Eli saw her and thought, she was praying that God would give her a child. And Eli thought she was drunk.
That's right. It's another story about drinking
Right.
and the parents. That's right.
Yeah, and she told him her story, and she went back and had the child.
Yes, and
Exactly.
he was going to be dedicated. Remember,
He was dedicated to the Lord.
dedicated to the Lord
She came
there.
back and brought him and left him with Eli.
That's right. So you can see some connections. Like if you just read the story of Samuel, seems very similar in my mind at least, and I think the author's mind, whether that's again the individual author or God. They seem very similar. Like a lot of the same echoes of Samson's story come when you start reading about Samuel. Even their names themselves are very similar. Samson, Samuel, they're very similar. Now, but there are many other ways. So look at how the story is just actually introduced. There was a certain man from Ramathaim Zophim whose name was Manoah. There was a certain man from Zorah whose name was Elkanah. She was barren and had no children. Hannah had no children. The woman gave birth and named him Samuel. She gave birth to a son and she named him Samuel, as opposed to Samson, excuse me. Nazarite vow, no cutting of hair. Hannah had a vow. So, again, it seems to me that the author is making a really clear connection back to Samson and trying to help us see that we're just continuing the story. This is not a separate book. This is the next chapter. We've had 7 judges. They were all getting worse and worse. And now here comes another judge. It's very clear he's another judge just in the same way that those 7 were, except he's not the same. And that's what's going to become really interesting. Why I think it's even a separate book, because the story's going to turn. Because on the one hand, there's clearly a lot of similarities between them. On the other hand, there's no similarities between them. Right? What did all 7 of the judges do when they would come?
Save Israel from.
How? What would they do? They would fight. They would come and they would fight, right? Even Samson, as bad as his was, it was very indirect because of his moral issues. He still fought. He killed a bunch of people in his death. And even in his chasing of women, he killed a bunch of Philistines that way, right? But So that was what they did. Now, when Samuel comes on the scene, 1 Samuel 1 to 3 is kind of how he comes on the scene. 4 to 6 is a fight. But it's so different. Samuel's not mentioned. His name's not mentioned in the entire 3 chapters, even though he's the key character. He's totally off the scene. He's not mentioned. And what's different? What happens with all the judges when they fight? Do they win or do they lose? They win. Well, what happens in 1 Samuel 4 to 6 when Israel goes to fight the Philistines? They lose. They lose, and the ark is taken away, and it's brought sort of into captivity. And really the key point as you think about this is everything in that story reminds you, it's like Israel is going way back to the beginning. It almost reminds you of the plagues in Exodus. It's almost Egypt-like, and how Israel is going back into bondage, as it were. God has gone back. Remember, there's the story in Israel, the 10 plagues, right? And then the Philistines are getting plagued. And remember, there's this, the point of the plagues we've talked about in Exodus was that it's really a statement about Egypt's gods and how God is greater. I'll close that door to there. And in this case, you remember Dagon in the temple? I mean, clearly God is greater than him. And remember what the people did when they left Egypt? They asked for all kinds of gold and silver. They plundered them. But that's what happened too, right? They're sending back these gold and silver pieces. So there's all these things that make you think, okay, something different's happening now. God has raised up this Samuel. He's a lot like these judges, but in another sense, he's not like them at all. In fact, as we see in 1 Samuel 7, after the ark comes back, there is a battle. And this time, Israel wins. But where is Samuel? He's not there. Where is he?
In the temple.
He's making sacrifices, right? And how does the battle win? Who causes the battle to be won by God? There's earthquake. And that, again, Samuel seems much more like what person than any of the judges at that point? Moses. He seems much more like Moses, where, that's what Moses did when they fought the Amalekites. He's holding his hands up. And it's very clear that God is the one winning this battle. Very clear. And God, God's strong arm in bringing them out of Egypt. And that's what now is happening. It's on the one hand, yes, Samuel is like these other judges. On the other hand, God is saying, no, this is like Egypt. You're my people. I am going to care for you. It's like a statement of God, there's 430 years of just awful stuff. The appendix, okay, now let's bring it back. Just horrible. And here's what God's going to do. I'm going to raise up another judge, only he's going to be more like Moses, and I'm going to intervene. With strong power and miracles, I'm going to be your God. All right? That's really 1 Samuel 1 to 7. And that leads to our first key chapter, which is 1 Samuel 8. I think there's 3 key chapters in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 8. And that's what happens next. Well, in the Judges, always the passing of the judge was a big deal. Because when the judge passed, they got back into there were issues. Right? It was always issues after, whether it was Joshua himself or any of the 7 judges in the book of Judges. After that generation, there were always issues. So Samuel's getting ready to pass. I guess he's thinking ahead, and he's appointing his sons. Only it's not any good because his sons are no good. His sons are not faithful. So what's going to happen? So that's why it's this key chapter. This is transition. What's going to happen? Well, this is where Israel does what in 1 Samuel 8? What do they do? Okay, don't say that in just a second when I ask. Oh, sorry. Never mind. They asked for a king. Yeah, I forgot I had interpreted it. They asked for a king, right? What does that mean? Well, people debate. Some people say, well, that God had already said they could have a king in Deuteronomy. Like it's not a big deal, or it's just that they want to be like the other nations. That's the only. Well, the reason I paint the story that I do of 1 Samuel 1 to 7 is my personal view of this is that this is a rejection of God. This is. Here God has said, look, I'm going to lead you. You're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God in the way that I did coming out of Moses. And then when they came out of Egypt with Moses, and when they came out of Egypt with Moses, and he's up and God is giving them a law, writing with his very finger, what are they doing down below? Making a golden calf. And in my opinion, this is along the lines of the golden calf incident. This asking for a king is like that. Right? The golden calf, what did he say? He said, hey, here are your gods who brought you out of Egypt. That golden calf didn't even exist an hour before. He didn't bring them out of Egypt. Even if it did exist, it's a gold. It has to be carried, like Isaiah says. It didn't do anything. So it's blasphemous to say, here are your gods that carried you out of Egypt. Well, this is blasphemous to say, give us a king to fight our battles after God has just delivered them in the way he did out of Egypt. It's wrong. It's horrible for them. And if we read in Hosea 13, I won't read it for the sake of time, but Hosea 13, 10 to 11, God talks about how angry he was that they asked for a king. It angered him. It made him mad. He tells Samuel, they didn't reject you. They rejected me. Even Gideon, in the period of the judges, they asked him, set up your sons, let them be kings. And Gideon said, no way. If I had time, I'd read it. He said, the Lord is our king. He recognized it. Yes, sure, I got raised up to help, but the Lord's our king. And he wouldn't set up his sons as king. So this is them essentially rejecting God. And in fact, and that's why I say that the appendix isn't the bottom. The appendix isn't the bottom. The dreadful appendix of Judges. That's not as low as Israel can go. The low is God in grace reaching out to them and saying, despite you acting like Sodom and Gomorrah, and despite me not raining fire and brimstone on you like I did Sodom and Gomorrah, but me sending you Samuel, then you reject me. Like, that's really low. And that's not even the lowest. Because when we get to Ezekiel, Ezekiel 20, when they review Israel's history, you're going to see that at that time of the exile, they're going to not just say, give us a king among our people. They're going to say, we don't want you to be our God anymore. We want gods like the other nations. And God's going to rightfully judge them. But even then, it's amazing. He says, but I'm not going to let you do that. I'm not going to let you have other gods. I'm going to bring you out of exile and I'm going to give you a new heart. And that's the lowest. That's the end. I guess the lowest is really when they crucify Christ, when he comes. But this is, you have to feel how significant this asking for a king is. It's significant. It's like the Judges, the dreadful appendix. It's horrible. They've just rejected God. So God says, as he does in Romans 1, I'm going to give you what you asked for. But you're not going to like it. Because now, in addition to the peoples oppressing you, like the Midianites, burning your fields and keeping you from having anything, now your king's going to do that too. So even in the good times, he's going to take your best wives, he's going to take your best maidens and daughters, he's going to take your taxes, and now you're going to be oppressed externally and internally. So you're not going to like it. But God gives it to them. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and why, again, I think seeing the connections between these and understanding that is significant. Because for a moment, we took out the dreadful appendix, and we said, look, God is bringing another judge on the scene, and he's putting everything in reverse. He's going back, as it were, to Egypt and showing them he can deliver them out of anything. But we got to put that dreadful appendix in there because it was in there. Now, why? Why was it in there, and why were those stories selected? Well, here's why I think. Because there were probably worse things going on. I mean, there were probably other things going on at least. But here's why, or at least a reason why I think it's in there. Now, this is fascinating to me. It's one of the most fascinating things in all of 1 Samuel. But if you think, before I put it up here, just think about that 5 chapters in Judges and the things that went on. We enumerated them earlier. And now if you can think about what happened when Saul became a king. Can you think about any connections between those two events? Either the 5 chapters in Judges as well as Saul's sort of selection and rise to ascendancy to king. What was Saul doing when he became king? What was Saul doing when he met Samuel? He was looking for donkeys. He was walking around looking, right? So you have this story of people looking, and then what does his servant say? Saul's ready to give up. What does his servant say? Hey, there's a man of God in this city. Let's go see them. All right, now go back to Judges. Are there any stories of that kind of stuff in Judges in the appendix? Anybody looking for anything? Think about the Danites.
Sure there is.
Yes, you're right. Think about the Danites. They're going around. What are they looking for?
A person, a town.
Land. They're looking for land. They're going around, finding what's, and they say, hey, there's a man of God in this house. Right? Remember Micah? Let's go inquire of him. Very similar. What else? What about when Saul, the people don't want him to be king. They think he's weak. He was. They think he's weak of character or weak in general. And the men of remember what happens? There's the men of Jabesh Gilead. They're in trouble. This is kind of how Saul solidifies his kingship. They're in trouble. The guy says, look, come surrender to me. I'll pluck out your right eye. I don't remember exactly what he says. Something like that. And they say, well, let us call for help. They call for help. They send to Saul. What does Saul do?
Raise an army.
What does he do? How does he raise an army? He does raise an army, you're right. How does he do it?
He tells everybody that if they don't come, what's going to happen to them.
What's going to happen to him?
Like they're going to come attack them or something.
Close. What does he do? Remember, where is Saul when he gets the message? He's out in the field. He's plowing. Right? And a messenger comes and says, here's what they said to Jabesh Gilead. They're going to go fight them. They're going to pluck out their eyes. Come, we need to deliver them. So Saul gets off the tractor, as it were, the plow, and he does what?
He cuts it up.
He cuts up the ox. He cuts up the ox. He divides it in 12. He sends it throughout the territory and says, you better come. All right, does that remind you of anything in the appendix?
In the concubines.
Yeah, right? So here you have this Sodom and Gomorrah type incident. The concubine takes the Levite takes her, cuts her up, distributes it out. Right? So you have these stories again repeating. Even where Saul was, his hometown, where he was from. Let me just go ahead and put it up there. Saul is from Sodom and Gomorrah, or I use that figuratively. He's from the town where that concubine was mistreated. That's his hometown. So when Saul's announced, he's from a Benjamite from Gibeah. There's the assembling at Mizpah where they decide, they cut up the people, they cut up the concubine, they send her out, they meet at Mizpah, they cast lots to see who's going to go up. That's exactly what happens in the Saul story. They cut up, they gather, they assemble at Mizpah, they say who should go and fight it and go deliver Jabesh Gilead from I think it's the Ammonites. There's the difference, there's in one case we're attacking Jabesh Gilead, the other time we're defending it. So anyways, my main point here is saying it's clear that the author expects you to know Judges, and it's clear that he's hearkening back to that. And the only thing, as I think that and I read that, it seems very clear to me that he's making a statement about Saul here and the kind of king they're going to get. They want a king to be like all the other nations. I mean, it's Saul. Everything about him makes you think about that horrible 5 chapters of Judges, that dreadful appendix. It's failed from the beginning. And so Saul doesn't listen to God. And it's something very simple. It's a really confusing story. My kids asked me about it as we read through it, and I don't fully understand it yet. But at the very beginning, when Saul's looking for donkeys, he says, hey, you go, do what your hand finds you do, wait for me 7 days, and then I'll come to you. And then a lot intervenes in between there, like Jabesh Gilead and all those things. And then eventually we find ourselves, Saul is afraid of the Philistines, and he's unwilling to wait. He does the sacrifice himself. Samuel shows up and says, why didn't you wait? And he rejects him as being king. Something about the ordering, I don't understand how it's chronological, but in any case, Saul doesn't wait. And we're going to talk about that next week, about that concept of being patient and waiting, because that's something we see at other points in the Bible as well that we'll learn about next week. But all that being said, Saul fails, he's rejected as being king, and then we get to the next key chapter in Samuel, which is Samuel 12, 1 Samuel 12. And that's where God, again, responds. So he responded to the dreadful appendix of Judges by providing Samuel and by saying, I'm going to be your God like I was when you came out of Egypt. They went even lower, asking for a king, so he let them go have this king they wanted. He let them remain in the sort of wickedness and awful, dreadful appendix with their new king Saul, but now God's not going to let them just live there. He's going to provide grace, and that's what chapter 12 is about. And again, it will be even clearer next week when we talk about how God covenants with David, and we'll see that even more clearly. But God is here intervening, and he's going to provide grace, despite how low they've gone in rejecting him and asking for a king.
You may have said this and I missed it. Do you think that God gave them Saul as a bad king on purpose as a judgment against them? Because he chose Saul.
He did. He sure did. And, in one sense, he chose Judas, because of his purposes. And so I do think that, for God, for Samuel even, to know the location of the donkeys and that he was looking for it, clearly they knew the character of Saul and what he was going to do. And I do think that, as in 1 Samuel 8, when he says, here's what your king's going to be like, and that Saul is purposeful, that I even think that Saul is somewhat, no, that's going too far. I'm not going to say that out loud. But if I could turn off the mic for just a second, because this is not, to me, it's going too far. But I would say, in some sense, he's even just very similar to like the Antichrist and what that's going to be like. I mean, I think about, maybe we can talk about that offline, because that's too far. I don't know that I can make that connection very clearly. But I do think that Saul is typical of here's what it's gonna be like, and so I think God, in that sense, did choose him, knowing those things.
Do you think he was a believer?
That's hard. I don't know. I think that I'll answer a different question, which is not. I'm evading the question, but at least better than a politician. I'm admitting it. I will say that I think oftentimes. Like in 1 Corinthians 10, where they're using Israel as an example of having, Paul says, take heed lest you fall, and people will say, look, you can't tell me that all those people weren't saved when that they didn't make it into the promised land. Even Moses didn't. And what I would say is, I don't think that's the point that Paul's making. He's saying, in the same way that they appear to be part of the covenant people, they had promises to go in, they didn't make it. In the same way, you may be a part of the covenant people. You may have made professions. You may have seen miracles. You may have been baptized. It doesn't mean you're going to make it into glory. You need to be careful about your pride and watch that you don't fall away. Because just because you thought you were part of the people doesn't mean you're going to make it. And again, I totally believe in assurance. Don't hear me wrong. But I think that sometimes it's hard to answer because they're written as examples. And I do think it mattered. Like people had faith or didn't. They were believers or not, but I think oftentimes the scriptures are written not to address that specific question, but to provide an example to us, which I think about even in the Old Testament, a lot of times, a lot of the salvation that's discussed is from death. And I don't even mean like spiritual death. It's like, deliver me, Hezekiah. He just wants to live more. He wants to be able to praise God on earth. It's not a fully developed kind of personal eschatology, whereas I think in the New Testament, they look back and they say, there is something bigger than the land. Not that it's not important, and it is important, but there's something bigger than that. And there's this personal salvation and personal, eschatology. And so sometimes to me it's hard to look at individuals in the Old Testament. I think sometimes like Nebuchadnezzar, you can make an argument like, oh man, that confession alone. But even there it's hard. Like I don't know what he did the rest, sometimes it's hard. I just think it's to answer that question. Whereas in the New Testament you can look at like Judas and say there's no way.
Right.
There's just no way.
What we say, there certainly were other kings of Israel that we would be sure weren't believers. Bad kings.
Yeah, but even like Manasseh, even for sure, Manasseh, if you wouldn't read Chronicles, you'd say there's no way. And then you read Chronicles, you're like, oh, he repented in jail and he became what all appears to be a believer. And so maybe, we only have a little bit of what's written, and so it's kind of hard for me to answer it. He wasn't a very good character. Saul wasn't, to be sure. So if I had somebody put me on the spot, I don't know what I would say. But it's hard to be put on the spot because I feel like we don't have enough info.
Right. He did prophesy.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I think 1 Samuel 12 is a really key chapter. It's God's promise of grace. And he says, look, you did really bad in asking for a king, but I'm going to turn it for good. And indeed, it was part of God's plan. Just like Adam and Eve did really bad in what they did. But God is going to turn it for good to show his glory, to show how he'll save a people in their sins. So God's going to use it for good. If your king will do these things, then I will bless you. And everything will be okay. In fact, it's amazing. Again, God had already made provision for it ahead of time in Deuteronomy and what the king needed to do. So that's a really key chapter, is God responding in grace. There's grace all over the Old Testament. Don't let people tell you that there's not. There's wrath all over the New Testament. Don't let people tell you that there's not. There's one God. 1 Samuel 13 to 15, Saul being rejected as king. And then this is the last key chapter, is God chooses David, which is going to be, that's going to be impactful for the rest of Scripture. Because it's going to be not just through Kings and Chronicles, and it's going to be the chosen one, the Messiah. In fact, this is where we begin to use that terminology. It's certainly been prophecies in Genesis and other times of a coming one. But here we start to talk about this anointed one, which in Hebrew is Messiah. And so now there's this promise of a coming king, and David is chosen, a man after God's own heart. I'm just talking and I'm not keeping up with my notes here. Okay, the rest of 1 Samuel is primarily David fleeing from Saul. It's a lot of words given to that topic. I'm not sure I fully understand that, but it clearly at least shows the righteousness of David. It shows the failure of Saul. It shows the kind of person David is. Twice he has an opportunity to kill Saul, who's chasing him and has thrown a spear at him, and he refuses to do it. And it's really, for sure, a good view into David, this king, and what God would want as a king, someone who loves even their enemies, and won't use his own strength. I think that's another common thing we'll see throughout the Kings is relying on God as the source of strength. I mean, he says that, don't go multiply horses. Don't go do those things. Rely on me for your strength. And in Isaiah, when there's the prophecies, it talks about how the coming king is going to trust fully in God to deliver them. And you see that here in David and the way that he acts. I mean, I've got a slide later when we talk about the themes and the major characters, but even how there's a real distinction in how David and Saul respond to fear. Like David had, you remember Ziklag, when he comes back to Ziklag and it's been burned and everybody's gone and people are about to stone him. His own people are about to stone him. And how he turns to God and looks for help, and God delivers them. I mean, they were just still partying. He had caught them. They hadn't even killed anybody or done anything to the people they had taken. David delivered them all. Whereas Saul, very clearly here, when he's afraid, he doesn't listen to God. He sacrifices on his own. Even when he wins, you see a difference. You see David and how he reaches out. He's become king. He's reaching out. He's trying to join the tribes together. Saul's making statues of himself, as it were. So there's a real difference between those two. And the end is Saul defeated by the Philistines. So let's talk about the purpose statement. In the same way that Frank has encouraged us how we can figure out kind of what a book's about by looking at the main themes. That's a great way to do it. I'm going to, in this case, do the themes after. But think about those 3 key chapters. So you have Israel doing wickedly and asking for a king. You have God exercising grace and saying, even though you did that, I'm going to provide you a king that's going to be righteous and good. And as long as he obeys, everything will be fine. And then you have David chosen as that king and anointed. And so to me, this is how I would describe the purpose of the chapter, if I can speak that way, of 1 Samuel. God responds in grace to Israel's wicked request for a king and marks David as the one through whom he will continue to pour out his blessing. He's made promises to Israel. We've studied them in the covenants. He's not going to turn his back despite them rejecting him. And he's going to continue to bless them, and he's going to do it through David now. So, let me just, I think we've said all of these things. So I think we've said all of these things. I think the second bullet I would phrase differently if I would have changed this year, but he's going to discipline them still by other nations, but also they're going to find their kings are often the source of their discipline as well. So it's not as if it's only the king now disciplining them. Okay, major themes. I just have 2. The first one, what would we all say is?
Samuel.
No, not major people, major themes. Kingship. Yeah, that's definitely the major one. I mean, Judges sets you up for that. And it's really God is the king. There is no other. And that's, again, a way that he's going to use this for his glory, because the king that is going to be on the earth, the true Messiah, is going to be God himself as well. So there's no problem here. God takes what appears to be a conundrum and he solves it by bringing God in the flesh to be king. And yet he's this mediator on earth that is Israel's king. Israel wants to be like the other nations. God will use kingship for his own glory, despite Israel being wicked and asking for it. We already mentioned he foreordained it. And the last theme, I would say, is divine reversal. I mean, that's a key part of 1 Samuel. I mean, we were speeding towards the bottom, and God is going to take that, and he's going to care for his people, and he's going to make it good. And by the end, you have Saul dead, you have David in place, and things are looking up. And this is how the book starts. You'll remember I haven't given Hannah enough press. I should. I've got my own Hannah, and she is a key figure in this book. But her prayer is all about that, because you'll remember Hannah was being provoked by her other, the other spouse of her husband, and she's being provoked bitterly because she has no children, and it feels like she's cursed. And in her prayer, you see how, all through the prayer, she's talking about how God's going to bring down the wicked, bring down the proud, raise up the humble, raise up the righteous. You see it in her. She birthed Samuel along with 7 others, if I remember. So a real change, and that's how the book starts, and that's a big theme of the book. Saul and David. Saul is clearly the one in power. He's the tall, big, strong one. David is less to write home about, and yet inside him, he's got a heart, after God. They ask for a king and fight their battles, and they're there, and Goliath is challenging them, and where's Saul? He's in his tent hoping somebody stands up and does it. And here comes David, and he does it. So again, I mentioned the trend, and again, 2 Samuel is going to be completely opposite. Israel's going to hit their heyday. Kings, they're going to be, you don't think about it. You think about Israel, you think about Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Greece. Israel for a very short time looked like that under Solomon. They were a massively important kingdom. People were coming to them from Egypt to hear about them. So this is the beginning of that reversal. Very similar to what you see in the Gospels, where again that's the prayer of Mary and the prayer of Elizabeth. You see these same themes about how God has come to visit His people and change things. All right, major characters. Now it's your turn, Isaiah. Major character. Yeah, okay. Samuel, last and greatest judge, absolutely was, but much more like Moses than any of those judges. He was a prophet, a priest, blameless, unlike his sons, but no one was able to raise their hand and say, hey, you stole something from me, or you used your power in a way that was not appropriate. David and Saul, I went too fast, but David and Saul are also the 2 key figures in the book. Certainly others like Jonathan, but primarily David and Saul. And you can't, again, be more different. Let me just put up some of these differences for us to read. So we've mentioned a couple of those. We didn't mention how David would turn to God through the ephod, but God went through a witch. God went to speak to Saul, I keep saying the wrong thing. Saul went to a witch, or a medium, to learn what he needed. Okay, the Philistines are the other one. Another major one, other character here. I'll just kind of put these up here quickly and not spend a ton of time. I think that's all. So we're going to read about the Philistines for the next few books. Then they'll fall off the scene and they won't be important anymore. But during this period of time, Judges, Samuel, 2 Samuel, very beginning of Kings, they're already off the scene. But that's kind of their nemesis at the beginning of the millennium. We'll get the dates up there in just a second of when Samuel covers. So they're a perpetual enemy throughout the time of Samuel. The unfair advantage, if I recall what I meant by that, they didn't allow Israel to have any weapons. They took away everything. And so, they had really put Israel under their thumb before David came. They thought the Midianites were bad. The Philistines mistreated them much worse than any of those in the book of Judges. Okay, and then time period, and then we'll have a couple interpretive issues, and then we'll be done. So we'll talk about Solomon and how we know that date. That's a key date in all of dating the Old Testament. When we get to Kings, we'll talk about how we know that. But Solomon is sort of a linchpin in dating, and we believe he ruled from 970 onward. And so if you go back, David ruled for 40 years. That means he started around 1010. Saul before that ruled for 40 years, according to Acts. We'll talk about it's going to be one of the interpretive issues in just a moment. So that puts Saul back at around 1050, and Samuel was born sometime before that because he was old enough to be around when Saul's a young man looking for his donkey. So somewhere around 1100 BC, this is the time period we're talking about. From 1100, it covers date to the beginning of David's rule. So you get about 900 years or so, 90 years or so. So one book. Really slowed down. I mean, 8-10 chapters just on David running away from Saul. Whereas Judges, you'd have one chapter and then you'd be 100 years later. So it just really slowed down. It's a key time in Israel's history. Okay, interpretive issues. I have 3 of them. This one is interesting because there is no manuscript. So hopefully you guys have taken a class or read about how abundant manuscripts are for the Bible, and how we have a tremendous number of copies to confirm the readings we have. Well, this is one exception to that. One very small exception to that. We don't have there's a issue with 1 Samuel 13 where it literally says Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign. He ruled over Israel 2 years. Okay, and it appears that there's a problem with the manuscript at that point, and we don't have one that shows us what it is. We don't have a good manuscript here to clarify. And so you'll see the different versions. I don't know what different people have. Some people have the ESV. I think, Beverly, you may even have that. And I think it just leaves it out or something. And then the NAS, if I recall, in fact, I have them up here. The NAS adds 40 years old, and there's a way that they come to that. The argument is something to the extent of he has a son early on, Jonathan, who's able to command, I think, 1,000 people, and even has a grandson that's mentioned. And so he's got to be a certain age, when he started out. And so they fill in that, but we don't know. And so the ESV just puts ... Acts 13 talks about how Saul reigned for 40 years. There's one version, maybe it's even Josephus actually, I think, that says he reigned for 42 years. And so the 40 years would be a round number in Acts, if that's the case. All that to say, I think this last one at the very bottom is a good quote. Given that Acts 13:21 says he reigned for 40 years, the best way to approach this is just to say that the manuscripts we have are just corrupt at this point. And so, it's one of those things that will allow us to be really grateful for what great manuscripts we do. Let this be, an opportunity for us to recognize, wow, out of entire 66 books or chapters of the Bible, we're missing one little bitty thing like this. And that's amazing, given how writings have not survived over the centuries.
Do you think there's a manuscript that exists today that is correct and we just don't know where it's at?
Very possible. I'm sure.
The reason I'm asking is because there were probably times in the past where they didn't have manuscripts.
That's correct.
They found them, and so I'm just wondering, do you think it still exists, or do you think it was destroyed?
I'll answer a different question than the one you asked, but I'll be honest enough to admit it. I think there are manuscripts that exist that we don't know about today, which is not exactly what you asked, but it's close. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are a great example of that. It was not that long ago that we found them. Okay, so that's one. 1 Samuel 16, excuse me, is this is really not an interpretive issue per se, but liberal commentators will say that God's fine with lying, or that God himself lies. It's really, to me, it's less about the issue. It's more about it's interesting to see what God does. In answering the question, if I was Corrie ten Boom and the Germans came to my door, would I be comfortable saying, no, there's no Jews here, or answering in a deceitful way? Or, it's interesting that God tells Samuel, go anoint a king, which is a dangerous thing to do when there exists a king already. And he says, well, Saul's going to be really mad if I go do that. And he says, well, tell him you're going there for a sacrifice, which is true enough. He had a sacrifice there. But it's interesting. And to me, as I look through how God blessed the Hebrew midwives, and how God blessed Rahab, and how God instructs Samuel, to me, I would answer, I don't know if y'all have read about Corrie ten Boom. She had a sister who, good for her, this was her conscience. She said, I will not lie, and I forget how it worked. They came to the door. She said yes. Yeah. Anyways,
and
but
they had to go bust him out.
So I think I would lie personally, and I think I would answer deceitfully in a situation like that. I don't think this is given very much of a window for lying. Like I don't think I should lie in many other circumstances, but in something like this, it's interesting that God encourages Samuel to say, don't focus on that part. Tell him you're going to make a sacrifice.
Well, also just like when the Pharaoh told the midwives
Yes.
to go and, kill the firstborn, kill the, if it's the boy, kill it, whatever, and then they lied
Yes.
and said, oh.
They're so
it's
fast.
just so fast,
Yeah.
whatever, but God blessed them.
Yeah.
I don't think that he counted that as a deceitful lie, as in, you lied to me,
Yeah.
but, you protected mine.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. You get in those situations and there are not many good answers. I mean, it's just a bad situation to begin with. I mean, if somebody's annihilating a whole people group, things aren't in a really good situation to begin with, and they're not always clear. But I think these things would help me if I were ever in a situation like that. That's what I would take from this, I think. So here's a commentator that says that Yahweh will lie if necessary in order to move the king. I think that, to me, that's blasphemous, because very clearly the Bible says God cannot lie, and God never gets put in a situation like we might due to our frailty. But God doesn't need to lie and will not lie.
To get out of something.
No, he doesn't need to lie to get out of anything. That's right. And sometimes God, there are many times when you, in a tough situation, I think about Martin Luther or the thousands of people who have been put in a situation where their own life was at stake. And I think God's honored by them not deceitfully lying there and going, oh yes, yeah, I believe in the Pope or whatever. No, I think God's honored by somebody saying, okay, if it's my life at stake, I'm not going to deny God. I'm not saying that's easy, but I think in a situation like that, I would hope that I would, at least when it was myself. But if it's a wartime situation or something like that, I think I feel more comfortable with not being straightforward. Yeah. But I think there have been many people who have been very courageous and faithful to God when their own life was on the line, and they did not lie or they did not mislead. And they said, nope, you want to know where my loyalties are? They're with God. And if that means I lose my life, I lose my life. Okay, and here's much better ways of explaining that. Again, I don't think it's a hard issue. It's just an interesting one to me. And the last one is not as interesting to me, but I don't know why. It's just not. But to a lot of people, it is. And this is where the medium calls up Samuel, and the question is: was it an apparition? Was it a demon? Was it really Samuel? And I don't know. I don't give a lot of thought to that, but I put it up here because it is something that some people give a lot of thought to and are interested by. So I just put a quote up here, and I think if somebody again made me make a decision, I would say I think in some way that Samuel appeared. It was Samuel. I mean it. And I don't even know, it's interesting to see the lady was really kind of scared. Almost like, whoa, what, so maybe it doesn't happen often. Maybe it's normally fake, but for whatever reason, it did.
And I would say God can do what he wants.
Yeah. Samuel's clearly still alive, his spirit, or
right. It could have been Samuel, or it could have been whatever he wanted to use to say I'm sacrificing.
And that's where I'm at. So I don't know,
Right.
and I'm okay with that. But some people want to know. I just need to, And I guess if I had.
It seems like it's the most straightforward reading.
It does to me too.
There's nothing to indicate that it wasn't him.
No.
And, even though they were forbidden from using means like that, I think God did allow in that case to tell Saul what he was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for us,
He
You know,
could have like a dog talk too.
he can make it. That's right.
He can do things
But
that-
in the end times, Thessalonians talks about how there's going to be miracles done even by wicked people, and so there's power out there. I mean, the Egyptian magicians copied the first 2 or 3, I don't remember, plagues. There's clearly a spiritual realm and clearly powers that Israel is told to avoid, not because they don't exist, but because they're dangerous and not right, and that's not the way to approach it. I guess I'm with Frank. I think it's the way that it reads. But I agree that it can be. So I'm gonna just leave that quote up there. It'll be online if you want to see the whole quote. And that's my last slide. So next week we'll do 2 Samuel, and it will sound a little bit like the covenants class. It's because we're going to be talking about the Davidic covenant, and I'm going to be putting up some things, again, trying to put 2 Samuel in the line of everything that's come before it, and I'm going to try to talk about how you can see God making these covenants at key times and see how that 2 Samuel fits into that as well. So let's pray, and you guys got to go. I haven't made you late, have I?
No. Our flight doesn't leave. We don't need to leave the house until 2:45.
Okay.
We are going to kind of skeet on out because we got a few things we need to do before we leave.
Okay. All right, let's pray. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for your grace, particularly I think of, God, when I think about what Israel did, and God, how they didn't want to rely on you. They didn't want to have their faith ultimately in you. And I recognize it was really hard, Father. They had true enemies surrounding them. They were in a tough situation. But God, you're trustworthy. You're worthy of our trust. And God, I just thank you to see your character and see how even when they did something really wicked, even when they were like Sodom and Gomorrah and even worse, Father, you had grace on them and you used their wickedness for your own glory. I thank you for that display of you. And I even thank you for how you selected David and how you found a person who did have a heart like yours, and that it's possible to have a heart like you. And I ask that you give us your Spirit and help us to walk faithfully so that we would have a heart like David and be able even to discern, God, when to, as we were just discussing, when to be straightforward and to have the courage of a David who, when his life was on the line, he said, this Philistine, this uncircumcised Philistine can't defy the armies of God and can't defy the living God. And he stood up for you and was counted and really made a difference. And I just ask that you give us that same spirit in us, that we may love you with all of our heart, and that you may do works through us, God, that you ordained beforehand, that you would receive glory and we would have the joy of being a part of it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah.